At first light, the canyon looks less like a landform than an exposed machine. Mile after mile of stepped walls fall away in terraces so abrupt they resemble cuts rather than collapse, as if some buried process removed the earth in stages and left the profile open for inspection. From the rim, the scale is almost too large to judge. The ledges read like engineered benches. The shadowed drop reads like absence with edges. And in old black and white photographs, where depth becomes contrast and dust becomes haze, the scene takes on another quality entirely. Not ancient wilderness, not exactly. More like a site after work has stopped. A place so vast, the normal language for landscape begins to fail. The accepted explanation is simple, and in broad terms it is powerful. Rivers cut downward. Uplift raises a plateau. Water, gravity, frost, and time do the rest. Layer by layer, over immense spans, stone is stripped, fractured, carried away, and a canyon appears. In the official timeline, nothing here needs intention. No hidden industry, no lost operation, no buried administrative secret. The depth is geological. The shape is erosional. The terraces are natural expressions of rock hardness and slope failure. It is the standard account taught in classrooms, printed on trail maps, repeated in park literature, and supported by generations of earth science. And yet, there is a reason certain images refuse to sit quietly inside that explanation. Not because erosion is false, it is not, but because some forms within these landscapes look unnervingly familiar when placed beside industrial excavations, open-pit mines, terraced quarries, spoil fields, hall corridors, and cut faces documented elsewhere. The resemblance is not poetic. It is geometric. Bench after bench, level after level. Lateral shelves at regular intervals. Access lines where there should be only broken descent. Vast, displaced volumes with no obvious local repository. Once the comparison is seen, it becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. The official explanation remains, but it begins to feel incomplete. So, the hidden theory is not that every canyon was fabricated from nothing, nor that all geology is a cover story. The more serious possibility is narrower, and stranger because of it. Some canyon landscapes may be composites. Natural basins, river cuts, uplifted strata, and weathered rock, yes, but also areas later enlarged, terraced, or selectively excavated at industrial scale, then folded back into the category of untouched geology once the original purpose was forgotten, reclassified, or never publicly described in plain terms. That claim sounds radical only because the scale is radical. But scale does not make a thing impossible. It only changes the kind of records one has to look for. Begin with shape. Industrial quarries do not merely remove material. They leave a grammar behind. Repeated bench heights, lateral continuity, slope angles determined not by beauty, but by stability, equipment reach, and collapse risk. In aerial view, the logic is unmistakable. Terraces are not random because machines do not work randomly. They step outward and downward in sequences. When certain canyon walls are isolated from their romantic setting and reduced to contour, silhouette, or shadow pattern, the resemblance is unsettling. There is the same staged descent, the same broad working levels, the same sudden vertical faces between them. Geologists will say that alternating hard and soft strata create cliffs and slopes naturally. Often they do. But what matters is not that a resemblance exists in one place. What matters is how often the profile begins to read as extraction once you stop calling it scenery. Then there is depth. In ordinary conversation, canyon depth is treated as sublime, almost beyond measurement, while quarry depth is treated as merely industrial. But depth is just depth. The largest modern open pits descend thousands of feet. They remove mountains methodically and leave voids visible from space. Once that comparison is allowed into the frame, a psychological barrier disappears. The human mind stops saying this is too big to have been worked and starts asking a more practical question. If industrial excavation can produce stepped voids of immense depth in known cases, what exactly rules out intervention in landscapes now assumed to be wholly natural? Not intuition, only evidence. And evidence begins with the map. On maps, the problem becomes sharper. Early survey documents often reveal a landscape before its meaning has stabilized. Names shift. Access routes appear and disappear. Resource notation changes terminology. Certain areas are first described through utility, then later through scenery. That transition matters. When a place moves from extraction logic to heritage logic, records tend to simplify. The old complexity is not always erased. More often, it is absorbed and made invisible by category. What had once been listed as mineral land, reserve land, restricted land, or surveyed tract becomes parkland, federal holding, scenic corridor, or protected zone. The stone remains. What changed was the explanation. Look closely at contour behavior in heavily dissected regions, and another oddity emerges. Not all steep terrain reads the same on a map. Some slopes feather outward in chaotic drainage patterns, the signature of long, unmanaged erosion. Others maintain lateral regularities over surprising distances, as though incision has been guided by pre-existing levels. Of course, geology can impose regularity. Bedding planes do that. Differential weathering does that. But the question is not whether geology can explain terraces. The question is whether the specific regularity of some terraced systems, especially when paired with unusual access traces and abrupt transitions, might indicate a history of enhancement rather than simple natural formation. A map does not prove intent. It does something more useful. It tells you where intent would leave a consistent shadow. Old photographs deepen the ambiguity. In the earliest panoramic plates of major canyon landscapes, before color softened them into postcards, the walls often look harsher, more stripped, more mechanical than modern memory allows. The eye catches broad, exposed faces and descending lines that resemble roads, tram grades, or shelf cuts. Some of that impression is photographic compression, some of it is contrast, but not all of it. Early photography is valuable precisely because it records a landscape before later restoration, vegetation spread, tourism infrastructure, and interpretive language teach viewers what they are supposed to see. There is power in first impressions, especially when those impressions repeat across multiple archives. The record is still there. A fair objection appears immediately. Natural canyons do form terraces. Sedimentary rock breaks in benches, rivers undercut, talus gathers. Resistant layers protrude. Arid climates preserve sharp forms. Geologists are not inventing these processes to defend a narrative. They are describing real mechanisms that can be observed today. This matters because any serious investigation has to concede what the mainstream explanation genuinely explains. It explains why layers are visible. It explains why cliffs alternate with slopes. It explains tributary incision, alluvial fans, and the relationship between water and relief. But even when the mainstream account is granted in full, questions remain at the margins. Why do some bench systems appear excessively coherent over long distances? Why do certain access-like traces align with workable gradients rather than chaotic collapse? Why do some sectors resemble industrial logic more than erosional mess? The orthodox model explains most of the picture. The unease begins with the remainder. Engineering offers another lens. Large excavation requires more than cutting. It requires movement. Material has to go somewhere. In modern operations, this means haul roads, spoil placement, crushing, staging, drainage control, water management, and legal boundaries. If such a history ever existed in a canyon landscape, one should expect traces not of dramatic machines frozen in place, but of subsidiary systems. That is where the theory becomes more interesting, not less. Because across many old industrial districts, the primary purpose disappears first, while the support infrastructure survives longest in altered form. A rail grade becomes a scenic line. A service road becomes a ranger route. A settling basin becomes a meadow. A restricted parcel becomes a reserve. A legal easement outlives the reason it was created. Bureaucracies preserve fragments accidentally, not because they want to reveal a buried past, but because paperwork is harder to erase than memory. The issue of displaced material is often treated as fatal to the excavation theory. If immense volumes were removed, where is the spoil? It is a strong question, but it assumes all excavated material would remain piled nearby in obvious heaps, as in a modern mine photographed from above. That is not always how large systems work. Valuable fractions are processed and exported. Finer overburden is redistributed, washed into drainages, used as fill, spread in embankments, or lost to later erosion. In sedimentary regions especially, removed material does not preserve itself as a neat monument to removal. It travels. It slumps. It is reused. And if extraction followed pre-existing valleys or cuts, then part of the volume attributed to natural river transport may include sediment mobilized by human disturbance at scales later misunderstood. The landscape does not keep separate ledgers for natural and artificial movement unless someone takes the trouble to read them. There is also timing. Major infrastructure expansion in the 19th and early 20th centuries created a brief historical window in which impossible-looking earthworks became commonplace. Railways crossed continents. Dams rose in remote basins. Tunnels pierced mountains. Open pits expanded to dimensions once considered absurd. Entire towns appeared around a single seam, vein, or industrial contract. The era normalized mass removal of earth. Yet public memory sorts these achievements into narrow compartments: mining here, civil engineering there, scenic preservation somewhere else. It is a neat arrangement. Reality is rarely so neat. Resource frontiers and survey frontiers overlapped. Military mapping, mineral assessment, transportation planning, and land reservation often touched the same ground. If a canyon zone had once been examined not as scenery, but as material, one would expect that history to hide in bureaucratic timing more than in folklore. The pattern widens when one stops looking at a single canyon and starts looking across categories. Star forts, once dismissed as isolated oddities, begin to look like a repeated geometric language when mapped together. Buried infrastructure, once treated as local curiosity, becomes a network when old plans are overlaid. The same is true here. Around the world, there are landscapes officially classed as natural, but visually adjacent to extractive forms. Amphitheaters with bench-like rings, escarpments with shelf systems too regular for comfort, basin margins with haul road gradients hiding in plain sight. Badlands, whose stripped appearance echoes worked overburdened fields. This does not prove common origin. It does something more important. It breaks the spell of uniqueness. Once a form repeats, explanation must become comparative. The pattern does not disappear. Legal records deserve more attention than they usually receive, because law often preserves the practical meaning of a landscape long after language becomes ceremonial. Terms such as reserve, withdrawal, mineral survey, reclamation, right-of-way, improvement, and administrative closure can tell a very different story from tourist prose written later. Not every restricted or surveyed tract conceals an industrial history. Most do not. But the hidden theory does not need every file to cooperate. It needs only a consistent residue, parcels defined in resource terms before they were framed in scenic ones, access rights that outlast the apparent necessity of access, jurisdictional anomalies where the stated use of land does not fully account for the rights attached to it. In archival work, these are not conclusions, they are pressure points, places where the paper does not rest easily on the earth it claims to describe. Eyewitness descriptions, too, can be revealing, especially when they come from people who had no interest in mystifying the scene. Surveyors, engineers, military observers, and early travelers often described terrain bluntly. They noted grades, exposed layers, roots, hazards, usable ledges, water availability, and material quality. Their language was operational. When such descriptions make a landscape sound less like wilderness and more like a worked face, the effect can be startling. Not because observers explicitly say this was excavated, usually they do not, but because they record the land in terms that later become awkward. Serviceable ledges, remarkable cuts, regular shelves, passage lines, exposed sections of unusual extent. The words are ordinary, their accumulation is not. There is another reason ideas like this remain unexamined, and it has less to do with conspiracy than with categories. Modern institutions are built to separate fields. Geology studies deep time. Mining history studies extraction. Cartography studies representation. Public land law studies jurisdiction. Archives sort documents by agency, not by hidden continuity. A pattern that runs across all of them can survive for a very long time simply because no one is rewarded for assembling it. Add classification, land value, liability, heritage branding, and the embarrassment of revising an established story, and the inertia becomes immense. The truth, if there is one here, would not need to be suppressed in a dramatic sense. It would only need to be inconvenient, fragmented, and expensive to verify. And verification would be possible. That is what makes the subject so uncomfortable. Bench heights can be measured. Slope regularity can be modeled. Old access routes can be compared against modern topography. Archival surveys can be layered over current maps. Material balance can be estimated. Sediment transport histories can be re-examined with disturbance in mind rather than pure nature. Legal records can be tracked from mineral designation to scenic designation. Photographs can be sequenced. Geologists, engineers, remote sensing analysts, and land historians could, together, decide whether these similarities are superficial or whether some canyon sectors truly preserve the signature of intervention. The tools exist. What appears to be missing is not capability, it is appetite. There is also a psychological resistance that should not be ignored. People accept that humans can quarry a mountain. They accept that humans can reroute rivers, flood valleys, flatten ridges, and dig pits so large they alter weather and groundwater. But place those same capacities next to a revered landscape, and the mind recoils. Not because the comparison is irrational, but because it threatens a boundary between the ancient and the industrial that modern culture wants to keep intact. Some places must remain innocent in order for the story of progress to feel separate from the story of Earth itself. If that boundary blurs, then our history becomes heavier, older, less transparent. The canyon stops being only a monument to time and starts resembling a file with pages missing. What remains, then, is not a solved case, but a reframed landscape. The official explanation still stands where the evidence supports it. Rivers cut, plateaus rise, stone breaks. Ages pass. None of that vanishes. But layered over those truths may be another history, less grand in theory and more troubling in practice. That some of the forms we call purely natural may also be the residue of organized removal, later hidden not by a single lie, but by changing use, lost records, institutional compartmentalization, and the extraordinary ease with which scale turns evidence into scenery. The stone remembers. The record is still there. What changed was the explanation. So when you stand at the rim and look down into a canyon whose walls fall in worked-looking stages, whose shelves hold their level for improbable distances, whose maps whisper utility before they speak of beauty, the question is no longer whether erosion exists. It does. The question is whether erosion is the whole story. And if it is not, then the silence surrounding that possibility tells us something important about the way modern institutions handle landscapes that do not fit their categories. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that a hidden excavation took place in some remote age of impossible machines. It is that the evidence, if it exists, may be ordinary. Benches mistaken for strata alone, access lines dismissed as chance, records filed under the wrong purpose, restricted parcels never revisited, photographs admired but not analyzed. 1,000 small acts of interpretation, all leaning in the same direction, until an engineered absence becomes a natural wonder by consensus. The pattern does not disappear, it simply acquires a safer name. And that is why the debate matters. Not because the theory is comforting, it is not. Not because it flatters the imagination, it should not. It matters because landscapes are archives, and archives can be misread for generations when the first interpretation hardens into doctrine. Once that happens, every later institution inherits the same assumptions. The canyon becomes its own defense. Its scale overawes inquiry. Its beauty protects its paperwork. Its fame discourages suspicion. What remains is a place everyone can see, and almost no one is prepared to examine from the wrong angle. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.